Hello, welcome back to Math Time with Professor Prime, and I am your host as always, Professor Prime. And I want to talk about math and comedy today. Two seemingly disparate topics, but two topics that I enjoy, but are also more connected than one might think. Because I feel like both amount to storytelling to start, but we can go deeper than that. So my whole thing that I want to do here today is I want to talk about like setups of jokes and how there's a certain math to that, but also how math is used on comedy on a larger scale in different forms of media and just on a more meta level. So yeah, let's get into it. So to start, right, with comedy, the whole point is to make something that you know someone is going to laugh at. And there's layers to it, and it can also be used as a tool. But if we start at that base level, I can find a lot of things funny, right? I can find an image funny. I can find a word funny, right? And so we have that base level. But then we get into jokes. And there are levels to that, right? They can be complex or they can be simple. But if I had to be really, really general and talk about what goes into making a joke, I feel like there's a setup plus the punchline, and then that equals the joke. So you have all the setup leading to the part that's supposed to make you laugh, and we're saying that hey, that's a joke. And there's layers to that because that setup part, right? That can be divvied up a bit, right? Because you can say, hey, well, we have setup part one, and then setup part two, and then setup part three, and so on and so forth. And then we have the punchline, and I mean that punchline can similarly get divvied up. Like you can punchline one plus punchline two plus punchline three, and the idea is that you add everything up, you get the joke, right? And that's interesting to me. And when it comes to that setup, when it comes to that punchline, there's fun to be had with those because right, you could go for what you would think that most audiences respond to, or you could be subversive. I mean subversive, or you could have something that seems like a punchline, and maybe it is in most cases, but it also serves a part of a setup in the particular joke that you're telling, and I find that fascinating. And I, of course, like I like math, I like comedy, and those two have definitely intersected. I like my math jokes here and there. I've made a few in my day, and one of my favorite ones is going to be the following. So like I would teach, and I would talk about slope, for instance, and then I would start to talk about how that's used in different places. How you can't have calc without that, and then you could do calc in infinite dimensions, and then it's just like, oh well, I'm off tangent, and then it's like, huh, how about that, right? And that builds off of a classic joke, and it's like that's what you'd expect. But then I might be like, huh, a tangent joke in a math class. How derivative. So, I did my setup where I was talking about slope and, how it's used. And then that kind of, goes into the whole off tangent part, which seems like the punchline, but is really another part of the setup. And then the actual punchline is, that subversion. And normally I wouldn't sit there and explain my joke to you, but I wanted to do so for two reasons. One, that's kind of a good example in this particular video. But the other part is I wanted to show you that when I was making that joke, I was in fact not going off tangent. I was on point. Yeah. Why am I like this? I don't know, but you know what? I'm here for it. So yeah, there's different layers to the like different jokes, and then it gets more complicated depending on your situation. Because you can make a joke in passing, and might not think too much about that, right? But if you're doing a joke in a class, or you're doing it in a video, or you're doing it on a show, you're gonna have to consider timing, right? And I find that fascinating because you might have that, of course, initial formula that I mentioned. Let's say like setup plus punchline equals joke, but like I said, there's layers of complexity to it, and it might be different when you're dealing with a sketch show versus, let's say, a sitcom. Because if I'm dealing with a sketch show, right? I have, let's say, it depends on the length of the sketch show, but if you have something like, let's say, Key and Peele, right? They have that half an hour to do their sketch show, and really is less when you factor in commercials. So they have to have a certain idea of how long they want each skit to be, and within that skit, they have to decide how long they want the setup to be, how long they want the punch line to be, and just how that like all collaborates together. And I find that fascinating. And I'm going to talk about them again like a little later on, when I talk about more meta sort of context. Um, but yeah, so I find that fascinating. And then if you have something like a sitcom, for instance, let's say Community, or like Rick and Morty, and I mentioned them both because they're both made by Dan Harmon, and their humor styles are similar, but they do get at some different things. So they follow those same sort of formulas, but you might get subversive here and there, and then, there's a lot of meta humor in there, which is great. And so with those two shows, their humor style are like similar. The sort of thing that they're going for. They're going for a lot of meta humor, a lot of highbrow, but also lowbrow stuff at the same time. But what's interesting to me is like with Community, it does have a certain rhythm, it does have a certain flow to it. But there's some drama elements in there, definitely more so than Rick and Morty, and so I feel like the jokes have to like really play well with that. And there's some jokes that are just like so elaborate, that you might miss them, or you might miss things in the background. And to me, that's fascinating because they had to work that in within the time. So it's like, oh well, hey, I have like this 20 or so minutes to tell this story. How much can I fit in this like one scene? And so there's a lot of jokes, and I feel like the way that's done is just it's interesting. It's fascinating to me. And then you have something like Rick and Morty where they are like, I think, pretty fast paced, but you can miss that just because you get kind of wrapped up in a story where they're telling like so many jokes in X amount of time, and I think there might have been like people out there that have calculated just about how many jokes they're telling per minute, but the idea is that they're telling a lot of jokes. Some are gonna hit, some are gonna miss, but like it's a numbers game with them, and I find it interesting because with Community, they're telling a lot of jokes per episode, just like Rick and Morty, but it feels different, you know because I feel like it's more woven into that more, story driven narrative. Though that isn't to say Rick and Morty doesn't have a story. I just feel like there's like more episodic episodes in there. But all in all, I do find this sort of thing fascinating because when you look at the meta context, I think it gets even crazier because you have the idea of making a joke, something that is supposed to make people laugh, and then you have the format that you're telling it. If you're going to tell in a book, pacing is a very, very different thing. And it's not that you don't have to worry about that, but I don't think it's as strenuous as it could be, like if it was like TV or movie or something like that. But that's debatable, right? Because if you're an author, it might be trickier to write that into your script. But the whole idea is like, you still have to worry about timing. You still have to worry about the formula of your jokes and going forth, what you should do in relation to like the size of your book. Like, hey, this is going to take up this amount of pages, or this is going to take like a sentence and this and that, and just putting it all together. There was a more eloquent way to say that, but anyway, so if you're doing something in a book or in an article, you still have to consider the length of the book or the length of the article, and you still have to consider your setups. But then I feel like it gets more complicated when you're dealing with movies or TV or even games. So with a TV show, like I said, maybe you have a sketch show or maybe you have a sitcom, and in both those cases, you have to consider timing in different ways, but you're still considering the timing. You're considering how many jokes you have to be have to say, and at the end of the day, Sometimes a story is a joke, and you have to decide how much time you want to devote to telling that story, and is it worth the payoff? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And like in the case that I said with Rick and Morty, you're playing a numbers game, and let's not forget, like a lot of these things that are getting made, they're getting made because like people like to laugh. Comedy is big, and it doesn't look like it's going anywhere, and so there's a lot of money behind that too. And then I find that even more fascinating because if you look back at Rick and Morty, that that affects how they write jokes. That affects how they tell their story. Because, they're making this deal and that deal, making some money from, sponsorship deals, and they're getting feedback from fans, and it's like, oh, so what do we do? We're kind of locked into this thing for X amount of time, X amount of episodes, and we want to stay true to our form, but we also know that a lot of people are watching, a lot of people are listening, and you could see in season 4 of Rick and Morty a lot of that playing out. Like they actually, made a lot of jokes about what was going on in their situation, and I think that's fascinating to me. And then back to like Key and Peele though, they had their show on Comedy Central, and I feel like that was doing well. And someone might look up the ratings and say how that was doing, but I feel like it got even more popular because of the internet, because they started posting things online, and you get those numbers driving things up. And if you're on YouTube, you get money being made involved from like advertisements. And one can't ignore money in comedy, and that's what we've been talking about for the last few minutes. But I think it's worth saying there's a lot of money in that. So it's just like that affects how you tell jokes too. Because do you play it safe, or do you play it risky? And that also means different things. Because being safe could be telling jokes that won't offend many people. Being safe could also be doing exactly what people might expect you to do, which in the case of some comedians is saying something a little risky. And being risky could mean telling jokes that offend people, or it could mean telling jokes that maybe haven't really been told before, or maybe most people wouldn't expect. And I think that's all very fascinating to me. And so there's so much that goes into comedy, because it's like there's the math behind actually setting up a joke, and then there's math behind you know the timing of the jokes, like how long will this be or how long will that be. And I guess when you think about it, speaking of timing, the delivery involved in that joke is like, if you're telling a joke straightforward, it's like, oh, okay, I need to say the setup at the right time, I need to say the punchline at the right time. But if there's something more involved, like there's a whole Beetlejuice gag that is played out over 3 seasons in Community, and it's like, so considering things like that works too. And so it's like timing is everything. And I find that funny because it's like I feel like that was a joke that pays off, especially if you're watching things back to back, like if you're binging it. So it's just like it's all interesting to me. And there's so many levels and layers to it, because comedy gets a lot of crap, but the truth is I do think it's more complicated than people give it credit for. And what's funny is subjective, and so you got to kind of play around with that, and you have to go off of what you've seen before and what's been proven to be money makers. But at the same time, you could be subversive because you know what's expected, and maybe you could do something that people weren't thinking of with this or that. Or maybe you can tell things in a decent way that people haven't seen. It's all depends on the person, personality, and all the things that I was saying before. Math's involved in the timing. It's involved in the money. It's involved in the setup of the jokes. Math and comedy are more connected than people think, and I hope that if you're watching this, you think about things differently and you add something to the conversation. So that being said, I'll see you all in the next one. Professor Prime out.